will land near the Shackleton crater to drill into the lunar soil in an area that could contain water ice. Prime 1 is made up of 2 instruments: Trident, the regolith and ice drill for exploring new terrain, and M-SOLO, the mass spectrometer observing lunar operations. Trident will drill up to 3 feet into the lunar surface, extract lunar soil, and bring it up to the surface. Trident drills to its maximum depth in multiple phases, stopping at different increments. As it reaches each desired depth, it will pause and retract the drill string to deposit lunar soil on the surface for analysis. This is where M-SOLO comes in. M-SOLO is a commercial off-the-shelf mass spectrometer modified for spaceflight. It will evaluate the chemical elements and compounds released from the lunar soil for water and other chemical compounds. Trident will then proceed to the next specified depth and repeat the process until samples at all desired depths have been analyzed for water. If no ice is found where Prime 1 lands, NASA will still collect valuable information about drilling into the lunar soil for a future mission. NASA's Viper, the Volatiles Investigating Polar Exploration rover, will use Prime 1 technology on a mobile robot that will navigate the Moon's south pole searching for additional resources. Prime 1 data will help NASA assess lunar resources to inform future Artemis missions and a robust human presence on the Moon.
So we are still awaiting a new T0 for today's launch attempt, but for more on what to expect when we launch for this first day, let's go to NASA's Dan Hewitt. He's inside our Apollo Saturn V Center at the KSC Visitor Complex.
Hey, thanks, Megan. Everybody, welcome back to the moon board. There's a lot of people here in the complex. I just heard a woo-hoo. People are getting in and out because we have a great view of launch when it's going to happen, and it's going to happen today. But that launch is just the first step in the Artemis 1 mission. So let's look at what's ahead for this historic first flight. As we just said, launch is step number 1. Those 4 RS-25 engines throttle up, followed shortly after by the 2 solid rocket boosters igniting, sending SLS and Orion skyward. Now on our way uphill, we'll have a number of jettison events. You'll be able to see things coming off of the SLS rocket. One of the most visual ones will be these 2 solid rocket boosters. Now they'll expend their propellant a little over 2 minutes into the flight. They will separate. We'll see them flare off onto either side, and then the core stage continues to fire. We're also going to see the launch abort system come off the top. Once you get high enough in the atmosphere, it's no longer required. You could actually do aborts using engines on Orion and its service module. I will also note that on the launch abort system, it's got those 3 solid rocket motors. The jettison motor is active. The abort and the attitude ones are not for this flight. We don't have people, so we're not flying a fully active abort system. We also have 3 fairings that are there to protect Orion, the service module and the crew module, as we're flying up through the really dense parts of the Earth's atmosphere. Next up, we'll hit core stage separation. So we've got 4 main engines. We'll hear MECO, main engine cutoff. Those engines will shut down, the core stage will separate, drop away. It's eventually going to splash down in the ocean. And that hands over the propulsion duties to this, our upper stage, the Interim Cryogenic Propulsion Stage, or ICPS. Its first job is to execute what's known as a perigee raise maneuver. So the perigee is the lowest part of your orbit. You have a perigee, that's your low part, and an apogee, that's your highest point. We're going to raise up the perigee, and that's going to actually put us in a nice circular path around the planet. And while we're there, that gives us time to check out Orion. We're flying it in space for the second time, the first time in this fully integrated stack with SLS. We'll be able to look at all of Orion's systems, make sure those solar arrays are capturing the sun's energy and turning it into electrical power for Orion's systems, make sure the communications are working, all of our guidance, navigation, and control. That is your time to make sure you have a healthy spacecraft before you do something that is going to send it to the moon. And that's next up on our list. That's the trans-lunar injection. For today's launch profile, that's going to be a firing of about 18 minutes of that single engine on the upper stage. Now that engine optimized for a vacuum, it's producing about 24,000 pounds of thrust. So it's a pretty big engine, and it's doing that because we need enough energy to be able to send our payload, Orion, beyond low Earth orbit and send it on a path to head out to the moon. Now, after that burn is complete, ICPS separates. It's going to do what's called a disposal burn. So it's going to send itself on a path from Earth around the moon and slingshot out into what's known as a heliocentric orbit. So it's going to completely leave the Earth-Moon system and go into orbit around our sun. But after it separates, propulsion duties get handed over to the European Service Module, and it's got a couple of different engines that it's going to be using, and we're going to be testing those out just on day one. We're going to do what's called the Outbound Trajectory Correction Burn 1, and we'll do a couple of these trajectory corrections as we're flying out to the moon, but that first one is that first critical test of this large engine, the Orbital Maneuvering System engine. That's the one that has the most thrust, generating about 6,000 pounds of force in a vacuum, and that's what's going to be doing a lot of our maneuvers, or giving us that pushing power as we do these maneuvers around the moon to enter into what's known as distant retrograde orbit, or DRO, and that's this dotted line that you see around here. Now, we call it distant basically because of the distance we're away from the moon. We're about 40,000 miles, a little bit less, off the lunar surface, and then we call it retrograde because the moon orbiting planet Earth in this direction, going in a counterclockwise fashion, we're going to be entering into a clockwise orbit around the moon, opposite retrograde. Now, to do that, we're going to get in close, we're going to dip in off the lunar surface, we're going to be about 80 miles, 80 statute miles off the lunar surface as we do this outbound powered flyby. Again, the major thrust coming from that Orbital Maneuvering System engine. After we do that, we'll do a final maneuver to actually go into that distant retrograde orbit, that DRO. Now, why DRO? Why are we not just going around the moon and coming back on like a free return trajectory, which we did on some of the Apollo missions? Well, in DRO, it's a very stable orbit. It doesn't require a lot of fuel to maintain that area around the moon. So it gives you a lot of time to really test the spacecraft. If you followed with any launch of a new spacecraft, you know there's only so much testing you can do on the ground. Once you actually put all of that hardware in space, in the environment that it's going to be operating, hundreds of thousands of miles away from Earth, you're going to learn things you didn't even realize about everything from communications, the life support systems, the thermal control. Everything on a spacecraft needs to get put through its paces in this environment before we put people on board, and that's why we're heading out to DRO. Eventually, though, it's going to be time to come home, and we will do a DRO departure maneuver. This, again, firing up that Orbital Maneuvering System engine and others on the service module, and this is what's going to commit us from leaving the moon and heading on back towards Earth. We'll dip in once more, close off the lunar surface, slingshot and use the lunar gravity to do this return-powered flyby, and then, similar to the way out, we can make correction burns as we kind of fine-tune our path back towards the Earth. And then it's time for re-entry. A couple of things happen before that. One of the really critical ones, spacecraft separation. We're going to detach the European Service Module shortly before re-entry. Its job largely done. That burns up in the Earth's atmosphere and reveals on the crew module the heat shield. I circled it earlier. This is goal number one of the Artemis mission. Artemis 1 mission is testing this heat shield at lunar return velocities, because when we make that trip around the moon and we come back, we are going in speeds of excess of 20,000 miles an hour. So when we slam into the Earth's atmosphere, it's going to heat that thing up to more than 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit. For the Artemis 1 profile, we're going to do what's known as a skip re-entry. So basically, you can come in too shallow and skip off the atmosphere, too narrow, and you're going to do what's known as a ballistic entry, which really heats things up. We're going to do kind of a mix where we're going to skip once off the atmosphere, and that we're still going to get the heat, but that helps to reduce some of the G loads on the crew. Once you're through that, you get to parachute deploy. There's 11 parachutes in total that are going to slow Orion down before it splashes down. We're going to be going from 20,000 miles an hour to about 300 miles an hour before those parachutes deploy, and then they do a final job of getting it in the water in the South Pacific. We've got these big orange balloons. That's an uprighting system, so even if Orion landed in the water upside down, those can inflate and they put us back upright into what's known as stable 1. That's where you want your spacecraft to be, nice and upright in the water, especially if you're an astronaut in there floating. Now, we also have a large U.S. Navy ship with a big bay that's going to basically come up and swallow Orion into its deck, and you've got a couple of other assets in the area to help recover hardware, the forward bay cover, parachutes, things like that. But that's scheduled to happen 26 days after a launch today. So that's 26 days from liftoff here in Florida around the moon to a splashdown in the Pacific. And that will be the first mission in the Artemis program, the farthest we've ever sent a human-rated spacecraft in history. And just the first step before we put people on board. So that's a look at everything still to come. We're counting down to that launch. I'll send it back over to Megan and the team at the host desk, guys.
A very comprehensive look at that. Thank you so much, Dan. If you're just joining us, welcome to Kennedy Space Center and our live coverage of Artemis 1, an uncrewed flight test that will return us to the moon in nearly 50 years. But you know, some might ask, why the moon? Well, here's why.
We are going. The history of this agency is marked with broken barriers, once viewed as impossible, with science fiction turned reality, with innovations that have spun industries all their own, and with demonstrations of peace for all humankind.
We soar in the skies of our home planet. We maintain a human presence just outside of gravity, and we touch points all across the solar system and beyond. We're going back to the moon, and this is why.
The moon is a treasure trove of science.
It holds opportunities for us to make discoveries about our home planet, about our sun,
and about our solar system.
The wealth of knowledge to be gleaned from the moon will inspire a new generation of thought and action.
Without fail, every major program and mission NASA has invested in has led to technologies and capabilities that have shaped our culture.
The breakthroughs of the Artemis era will define our generation and the generations to follow.
The tens of thousands of jobs associated with propelling us to the moon today are just the beginning of a lunar economy that will see hundreds of thousands of new jobs develop around the world.
This is not an ambition of one entity or one country. The exploration of the moon is a shared effort,
Woven together by a desire for the greater good.
Why the moon? Because the missions of tomorrow will be sparked by the accomplishments of the Artemis generation today.
because the ambition to go has already begun.
And because Mars is calling. We need to learn what it takes to establish a community on another cosmic shore. So let's camp close before pushing out.
And so, we go to the moon now, not as a series of isolated missions, but to build a community on and around the moon capable of proving how to live on other worlds.
We'll use the lessons from more than 50 years of peaceful exploration to send a new generation to the lunar surface to stay.
We will anchor our efforts on the lunar South Pole to establish the Artemis Base Camp,
positioning us for long-term science and exploration of the lunar surface.
We will prove what it takes to assemble a complex ship in deep space.
We will perfect descending down to and returning from a distant surface.
We will learn how humans can survive and thrive in a partial gravity environment.
With improved spacesuit designs, mobile habitats, and with reconnaissance robots pre-positioning and relocating supplies.
We will learn how to utilize the resources we find on these other worlds, starting with finding water ice and purifying it into drinkable water.
And refining that into hydrogen for fuel and oxygen to breathe.
We will establish fission power plants on the surface of the moon, capable of supporting a growing community of efforts.
And we will expand the logistics supply chain to enable commercial and international partners
to resupply and refuel deep space outposts.
None of this is simple or easy, but nothing in our history ever has been.
The Eagle has landed. You got a bunch of guys about to turn blue. We're breathing again. Thanks a lot.
This kind of continuous lunar presence is a natural extension of all that we've learned in low Earth orbit. And what we will accomplish there will ensure the monumental missions to Mars are within reach. As we ready the launch of the first Artemis mission, and as commercial companies ready their lunar landers for the first private payload deliveries, we have already begun to take the next step.
Throughout this launch broadcast, our NASA's Leah Martin has been introducing us to people over at the Kennedy Space Center Visitor Complex who have come out for hopefully the maiden voyage of Artemis 1. People from near and far, young and old, just really excited to hopefully see this historic flight. So now she's joined by somebody else who has a really interesting story. Leah, tell us about it.
Megan, I think one of the most exciting things about being here tonight is being with people who are like-minded, who have such a strong tie to the history of our nation's space program and their love of spaceflight. And I actually struck up an amazing conversation with Scott here, and you were telling me about the special tie that you have to tonight's launch as well.
Oh yeah, I literally grew up with NASA. My father went to work with the NACA before NASA. Went to work for Dr. von Braun, followed him over to Marshall Space Flight Center, and became, when it became NASA, he worked on the Jupiter C, Redstone, Saturn 1, Saturn 5, and then because of that, he brought me here to see Apollo 11 launch. So that was my first launch. I was 5 years old. I loved it. Still remember the sound. That's about all. And then years later, through my flying career, I was able to bring my sons back with my friends that flew the shuttle, and they saw 5 launches and 4 landings. But basically, I wanted to be here. I was here for the first moon launch, the last moon launch back when Uncle Gene Cernan, our family friend, went to Apollo 17. So I wanted to be here for this because it's kind of in our family, in our blood. And hopefully I'll be around for the next one when we go and land again. So that's
incredible. So you have NASA actually in your DNA, grew up with the program.
Yeah. I knew most of the German scientists. The kids sat in our lap, Dr. Ernst Stirlinger, and my father flew with von Braun because he was a general aviation pilot as well. So they'd get off work and fly. And they were in Life magazine together, National Geographic. So it was fun. I literally knew Al Shepard, all the Mercury, Gemini, Apollo guys, and it was an honor. I would have loved to have been an astronaut, but I went a different route, but I can still come here and see them.
We can, and we're so grateful, so thrilled to see you here tonight, and so excited that you will be able to actually compare the last launch and the sound of the last one with the one tonight. It's absolutely going to rock the sky.
I want it to be even louder. I want to feel it. Yeah.
Thanks so much for joining us tonight. It's been an honor to meet you, and Megan, we're going back to you.
Leah, thank you so much for sharing that. That was such a fun story. Here we are now at Space Center Houston. This is a live look inside of the visitor center there. Lots of people hoping to see the launch today. I love this guy in the front with his NASA shirt representing. And again, just seeing children